Hello and welcome to another episode of Levy's Customs. I'm your host Nathan, and today we're going to be taking a look at an Acer Nitro 5 from 2017. Now this laptop was a client's laptop and they wanted me to replace the screen. I'm guessing someone shut the lid of the laptop when there was something on the keyboard or something because of the way it cracked. I had to replace both the screen and the top part of the lid because the damage was so bad, and I replaced it with the wrong screen. The original screen was a 60 Hz 1080p display, and the one that I put in, which does work perfectly fine, is a 120 Hz panel with at 1080p. This model, the AN515-51, has the following specifications. An Intel Core i5-7300HQ with 4 cores and 4 threads, a base clock of 2.5 GHz, and a max turbo of 3.5 GHz. For the graphics card, we have an Nvidia GTX 1050 Ti with 4 GB of GDDR5 VRAM, a single 8 GB stick of DDR4 2133 memory, a 256 GB M.2 NVMe SSD, but I did add a 1 TB hard drive for games and storage. It has a 15.6-inch 1080p 120 Hz IPS screen, a 48 Wh battery and 135 Watt power adapter, AC Wi-Fi, Bluetooth 4.1, a webcam, and dual microphones. On the left side, you get an SD card reader, USB 3.0, HDMI, 5 gigabit USB-C, and a gigabit Ethernet port. On the right, you get 2 USB 2.0 ports and a 3.5mm TRRS headphone jack. All right, enough with the specifications for this laptop. Let's go ahead and see how well this laptop does against newer games. All benchmarks are done at 1080p and 100% resolution scale. Thermal paste for the GPU and CPU have been replaced prior to doing the benchmarks, and all footage was captured externally via a capture card to another computer. First up, CSGO on medium settings got an average of 152 FPS and a 1% low of 36 FPS. CSGO ran well enough to keep up with the 120 Hz screen, but it would dip down into the 70s and 80s at times. Cyberpunk 2077 on the lowest preset and medium textures got an average of 34 frames per second and a 1% low of 20 frames per second. For the most part, Cyberpunk ran in the 20s but would rise into the 30s when indoors, and it was a pretty choppy experience. Doom Eternal on the medium preset got an average of 57 frames per second and a 1% low of 39 frames per second. For the most part, the game ran above 60 FPS, but would dip down in the 50s and 40s during cutscenes. Far Cry 5 on the normal preset got an average of 45 frames per second and a 1% low of 34 frames per second. Gameplay ranged from the mid-40s to the high 50s. GTA 5 on normal settings got an average of 83 FPS and a 1% low of 47 FPS. GTA stayed mostly in the 70s to 80s, but would occasionally dip into the high 50s. Red Dead Redemption 2 on the first tier of the balanced preset got an average of 32 frames per second and a 1% low of 22 frames per second. Most of the time it stayed between 28 and 34 frames per second, which I felt was playable for a single player game, though I would recommend turning down the settings a bit. Resident Evil Village on low settings and medium 0.5 GB textures got an average of 54 frames per second and a 1% low of 37 frames per second. Most of the time it stayed in the 50s and low 60s, but during cutscenes it would drop into the 40s and sometimes even into the 20s. Star Wars Squadrons on the medium preset got an average of 97 frames per second and a 1% low of 61 frames per second. I rarely saw the frame rate drop below 80 FPS and the game ran pretty smooth. Rainbow Six Siege on the medium preset and very high textures got an average of 122 frames per second and a 1% low of 70 frames per second. Frame rate varies on different stages, but I never saw it drop below 90 frames per second. Fortnite on the medium preset and DirectX 11 got an average of 106 frames per second and a 1% low of 61 frames per second. Despite the decent frame rate, there were frequent major stutters, dropping down to 1 frames per second sometimes, which unfortunately seems to happen a lot when I benchmark this game. Not sure what the issue is. Forza Horizon 4 on the medium preset got an average of 69 frames per second, nice, and a 1% low of 29 frames per second. Forza ran pretty smooth, but dipped into the 40s when customizing cars. Metro Exodus on the medium preset and DirectX 12 got an average of 84 frames per second and a 1% low of 45 frames per second. Frame rate usually stayed above 60, but would dip into the 50s and low 40s when viewing far-off areas. Overwatch on the medium preset got an average of 116 frames per second and a 1% low of 38 frames per second. Frame rate fluctuated a bit, ranging from the mid-80s to 140 plus frames per second depending on on-screen effects. Warzone on low settings got an average of 44 frames per second and a 1% low of 14 frames per second. This game ran better than I expected, as my personal gaming laptop, that has a GTX 1070 by the way, performs worse than this laptop with similar settings. The varying performance of this game on PC is truly maddening. Cinebench R20 got an average single-core score of 332 and an average multi-core score of 1171. The Blender Classroom CPU benchmark finished in 34 minutes and 26 seconds. Puget Bench for DaVinci Resolve got a standard overall score of 353. Using DisplayCal and a Datacolor Spider X Pro colorimeter, the screen got an sRGB coverage of 99.1%, an Adobe RGB coverage of 78.8%, and a DCI-P3 coverage of 95.3%, which is excellent for content creators and photo and video editors. I will link what panel I got for this laptop, just in case anyone's interested, down in the description.
Alright, so here is the webcam on this Acer Nitro 5, and it is pretty bad, like really, really bad. I don't know how the microphone sounds yet, but
as you can hear, the microphones are terrible. The Nitro 5 has two downward-facing speakers, one on each side, more towards the front of the laptop, and this is what they sound like. They aren't great, but they're not absolutely terrible either. I didn't really like this keyboard. It feels very mushy to type on, and while I was typing, a lot of times I felt like I didn't press it all the way, so I would look up to see, and some of the times I just really hadn't. You really have to push these down in order for it to register. Here's kind of what this keyboard sounds like. The Acer has two exhaust fans put right next together, and they exhaust out a single exhaust vent on the back right side of the chassis. Now here is what the exhaust sounds like when I'm running the Metro Exodus benchmark program. As far as power consumption goes, even though the power adapter is 135 watts, I never saw the computer draw more than 120 watts at a time. Here is what power consumption from the wall looks like while running the Metro Exodus benchmark. With the added mechanical hard drive, the Acer weighs in at 5 pounds, 6.3 ounces, or 2,447 grams. This older budget gaming laptop did surprise me a bit with its performance. I'm not sure what the launch price was, but I know the Acer Nitro 5 series is kind of regarded as a good price to performance ratio laptop, but you do see the places where they cut back cost. For example, the chassis is all plastic and feels kind of cheap. The webcam and microphone are pretty subpar. And from some of the reviews that I read of this laptop, a lot of people complained about how bad the OEM screen panel was, or is, so just keep that in mind. I feel like this laptop does still have some merit, though I would not buy it for more than $350 to $400 used. It will struggle with newer AAA titles, so you will have to bring down settings and maybe even the resolution to get these games to run at a decent frame rate. So, what did you guys think about this 2017 Acer Nitro 5? Do you guys have this laptop? Let me know down in the comments. And just a reminder to rate this video with a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Also, if you like this video, hit that subscribe button and consider donating to Patreon so that I can continue to buy more components and computers and stuff like that. Anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.